4 people have been convicted of being part of a satanic sex cult in West Wales, whose activities included sexual acts with children and rape. Swansea Crown Court was told that Colin Batley, who was 48, set himself up as a high priest of the cult and modelled himself on the infamous occult practitioner Aliester Crowley, who called himself the Beast. He died in the 1940s. Tom Singleton of Radio Wales has followed the case throughout over several weeks, a distressing case. Tom, just give us an outline as to what led to the downfall of these people.
Well, Jim, this was a group of 4 people. Colin Batley, you just mentioned his wife, Elaine, and 2 other women, their neighbours Jacqueline Marling and Shelley Miller. They lived in adjoining properties on the same cul-de-sac in Kidwelly, which is a quiet town on the coast in Carmarthenshire. What emerged over the 4 weeks that group was on trial is in that pretty unassuming location, this group formed a satanic cult, which had Mr. Batley at its head. As a cult, over a period of 15 years, they were responsible for a horrendous catalogue of sexual abuse against children and young adults, including many instances of rape. They had multiple victims, one a boy as young as 6. Over the course of the trial, those victims gave harrowing accounts of what happened to them. And it was those victims coming forward, Jim, that brought this cult down in the end. What all of them said was that it was the group's occult beliefs and occult practices that was used to justify what was being done to them. In particular, the Book of the Law, a text by the occult writer that you mentioned, Aliester Crowley.
Now, as I say, he was born in the 1870s and lived through to the 1940s and was a pretty infamous figure. I mean, what were the sort of ideas, if we can call them that, were adopted by Batley and his, the people who turned out to be his co-defendants in this case?
Well, Jim, when the police searched the homes of Batley and all the other cult members, they found laminated copies of Crowley's text in each of their homes. Prosecutors in this case highlighted sections of his writings, which they said stated that sex with anyone was to be encouraged, as was rape. And they said that this group, and in particular Batley, put that idea into practice. They said it also helped Batley establish his authority over the other cult members and intimidate his victims. Those victims spoke of feeling brainwashed by Batley and said that he threatened them with punishments derived from those occult beliefs, threats that at the time to them seemed credible. But it was just one of the ideas of the occult with which this group was obviously obsessed. The women all had matching tattoos with Egyptian-style iconography, and the group would also hold occult rituals where the abuse of these victims would often take place.
Just a quick one finally, Tom. I mean, what has been the reaction to the revelations in Kidwelly and the area in West Wales where all this occurred?
Well, understandably, Jim, there's a sense of shock there. You know, what else could there be at something so horrendous happening in their midst and over such a long period of time as well? People there have spoken to me about wanting to move on from this. Easier said than done, perhaps. The real fear there, though, is that Kidwelly, which is an otherwise fairly unremarkable, if pleasant enough, provincial town, it will become synonymous with this cult and the awful things that they've done.
Tom Singleton, thank you very much indeed. You've been following this case. We can have a word with Paul Newman, who's a biographer of Aliester Crowley. A lot of people, Paul Newman, will know the name, and they might know the sobriquet, the Beast, and so on. Just remind us what his power was over those who followed him.
Well, he was born in 1875. He was a Victorian, and his parents were Plymouth Brethren, who were very strict, and so he knew the Bible almost off by heart. And he identified with the Antichrist figure, and he saw that the one sin was restriction. And of course, in Victorian England, it was in the area of sexual behaviour where people felt most restricted.
So that's what he recoiled against,
well,
mostly.
Yes, and he thought that sexual health was necessary. You should express yourself, and the body was sort of self-regulating. What he didn't allow for is limitary lines and boundaries. And of course, any advocate of sexual freedom, I mean, he wasn't the only one. D.H. Lawrence, Bertrand Russell tried to, all this point, you all always come up against this. And so, you know, it's the same problem, very active today, because sex has many kind of ugly heads, and the idea probably that it'll find a natural balance. No doubt it will in some people, but sometimes it masters the personality and ends up in dreadful cases like one you've mentioned.
Indeed. And what's interesting about Crowley is that he has become, and no doubt still does, and judging by this case, an obsessive figure for people. I mean, they become absolutely riveted by by his peculiarities, by his dominating personality, by his weirdness, by everything about him.
Yes, well, I think when you find very unorthodox people, they tell you about the orthodoxy of society, and often you can study social dynamics through eccentrics. And of course, Crowley shocked in many ways. Sometimes he was a kind of playful figure who was colourfully dressing up. Sometimes he was a mountaineer and explorer. So he was a trickster, and he had many faces. He probably did not intend to willfully destroy people's lives, but he was like a supernova personality, a big, powerful, slightly kind of bloated influence who would draw smaller planets in and sometimes burn them up. He had intelligence and ability, and he had a certain social standing, but he could be very dangerous to weaker people who were drawn into becoming disciples.